An increasingly used form of online video for knowledge dissemination is the webinar, also known as webcasting. This content delivers information efficiently whilst overcoming the hurdles presented by geography, time and costs. In this session, we'll explore the different ways organisations can use webinars to share information across their communities and with their customers. To discuss this, we're delighted to welcome Sarah Platt, the co-founder and managing director of Kinura, a company long involved in live streaming of video content for a diverse client list, including Ogilvy, Tate, Haymarket Publishing, BMI, Coca-Cola and the British Film Institute. Sarah's also founded a new company, Say and Show, a live video webinar platform. Joining her is Bombora's TV's Head of Business Development, Stephane Barnett. Stephane's experience in the communications industry initially focused on delivering investor relations strategies that increased clients' visibility to engage with stakeholders for Precision IR and global business intelligence provider OneSource. He has long championed the power of webcasting. Sarah and Stephane will present their viewpoint on the different types of webinars and will then further discuss how these can help your organisation. So Stephane, what do you see as being the different types of webinars that exist?
Thanks for the introduction, Caroline. I think when we're looking at different types of webinars, we're asking ourselves really two questions, and that is what's the function of a webinar and what's the style of that webinar we want to put out. But I think before we actually look at those different styles, we need to ascertain, the very definition of what is a webinar. So dictionary.com defines it as a seminar, presentation, lecture or workshop that is transmitted over the web. So if you think about it, that's quite a broad definition of what a webinar is, especially if you think of, what people tend to think of a webinar is they tend to think of a very limited resource. So we go and actually look at the history of the webinar, we can get an understanding of how far we've come and the options available to us now. So sort of the first stage was internet relay chat, and it was just essentially people sharing communications via online text messages. On that we added file sharing, screen sharing, and the ability to then stream audio and video moved across to sort of the creation of web conferencing and webinars. What really took webinars to the next level was the added interactivity that was brought in by electronic meeting systems. And then webinars really became a prime way of organisations having web communications with companies alongside other technology like webcasting, web television and web conferencing as well. So now we've sort of understand what the webinar is and sort of the history it's gone through. I think we should look at the main functions that people use webinars for. So I think that the top two there really are ones I'm going to focus on later on, which is marketing and training and education. These are by far the most common uses of webinars. But I think it's also important to understand the other uses of webinars as well. I used to work for a company called Precision IR, and we were heavily involved in working with organisations to do the financial presentations, whether it be their annual results, their interim results, or the half-yearlies. On part of that was also is corporate social responsibility. People wanting to reduce their carbon footprint rather than producing big reports would take that onto an online presentation. And then you have other things like company announcements, town hall meetings, research meetings, charity events, and even myself who use webinar technology as part of my sales pitching at OneSource. So, I open up my meeting platform and demonstrate the product over online to my clients. It's just a lot easier than going and meeting them face to face and saves me a lot of time. So I think if we look at those first two, as I mentioned, first of all, we look at marketing. This is probably I'd say probably the number one use of webinars currently. It's a great way for companies to create a resource they can use to help them with things like product launch, lead generations and service updates, a way of getting out their messages and then having it as a reusable asset for ongoing marketing communications. So I think if we look at sort of two companies in particular that I think do this really well, and that's companies Huddle and Salesforce.com. Huddle, again, one of the fastest growing companies on the Google roundabout. A key part of their marketing strategy is using the webinar as an introduction to their platform and actually using it as a way of collating leads to contact. So if you can see on the page there, you'll see that when you actually click on the webinar, they're taking down your details and you're automatically put up to availability for a 14-day free trial of their platform. And then below that, you have sort of a variety of the Salesforce webinars that they provide. Now, these are all on demand and they're a mixture of sort of training webinars and also then getting the best out of the system to help increase your return on investment by using Salesforce. And I think that's probably why we're seeing that marketing and training are the two number one uses of webinars, because they tend to link quite well together. If we then move and look at training a little bit more and think about why this is increasing in people using the webinar technology, it's because it's a great alternative to classroom-based learning, training videos, FAQs and how-to guides. If you think about 10, 15 years ago, the first day you start a new company, they'd sit you down, they'd get the videotape player out, you put a video and you'd be sat down and watch an orientation program. But now, with online technology, this is all done online. I remember when I started one of my old companies, I had a number of training over a webinar, especially ironically on Salesforce.com, but by my head of HR. So you can do things like lectures, seminar, product training, market updates and product service updates, just to name a few. And then I thought it'd be interesting to actually show you a couple of examples of this as well. So the top one's Facebook, which you'd think, it's quite strange for Facebook to do a training webinar. But what they actually found was that although they had a number of companies signing up to their platform, particularly SMBs, using it as a marketing tool, they weren't getting anyone utilising that platform. No one really knew how to get the best out of it. So they had this idea of launching a classroom-based service online to teach these SMEs that had, already taken that step to using Facebook and provide them with a free resource to learn and how to get the most out of the Facebook platform for them. Then underneath that is actually one that I've used myself when switching across from a different phone to another one, which is Vodafone's tech team. So what they do is on their forums, if you're looking at a particular phone, they have invitation-only webinars for people that are interested in particular mobile phones, and they'll give you a run through the different features. And it's just a great way to help people migrate across different phones. And also, if you think about these Vodafone shops, they've only got some people in the store that can help you look through the mobile phones. So by having that online resource for you to go to as a first level of connection with that company is a great tool for them to use and a great way to train people on how to use different mobiles, and also different from your typical sort of training program that you might think of. And then I thought it'd also be show one that Bombora is quite heavily involved with, which is sort of Thomson Reuters William Maxwell CPD for the legal sector. So by creating the webinars, as I said, you create reusable assets, and what we have here is a content portal which people can go online and review the different webinars available for different topics and choose the area of learning that they're most interested in. And then if we go to the next slide, what we'll see here is that we have, I guess, what you'd call a fairly standard webinar player, but utilisation of different technologies included and production techniques to create a very different look and feel from what you might get from other webinars that people may be used to seeing. So I think what this has done and what we're seeing here is that new technology, production techniques, and added interactivity has given us more options so that when we're thinking about doing a webinar, we really do have to ask ourselves, what kind of webinar do we want? There's a variety of questions, and these are all going to change the dynamic of what your webinar is and effectively change the type of webinar that you're presenting on. So it can be live or on demand. Some presentations benefit from having that live feeling. Also, added interactivity comes with running it live. But for a marketing message, you might want to have a more controlled environment. You might want to have a more polished platform and version of what you're presenting across. So therefore, it's better to bring it into an on-demand version where you can record different segments at different times, stitch it together, and make a really nice, neat piece of content. Instead of the interactivity is there as well with the moderator being available online for questions and the polls and things of that nature. The next point is, well, do you want a single presenter or multiple presenters? Some people prefer having a talking head for lectures. Some people would rather have multiple people, like we've got today, talking about different areas where we're educating people, but we're getting different people's viewpoints. So that's another option. The other option is presentation or debate. So right now, I'm doing a presentation, but some people get the most out of learning with having a debate style in terms of people offering their different opinions. So if you think about a lot of events you'll go to, typically they'll have the headline speakers there, and then they'll have a segment where they might get 4 people on a couch and they'll discuss different topics and have a debate about the way this particular market's moving forward or the effectiveness of using this technology. So choosing between those two vastly changes the way your webinar is going to look. The next one is, do you want to do it in a studio like we're doing today, or do you want to do it on location? Do it on location, you can get that live audience atmosphere that you might want, and it might also be beneficial if you're doing a live event, you want to capture on that and have that as a reusable piece of content. But there's great benefits about bringing it inside the studio as well, and actually bringing again more control to you over the image of what you're putting out, more control over the content, and more control over your performance, which you can lose in the moment on an on-location shoot. But then there's a number of other questions we can ask ourselves, and the ones I've got there aren't the end of them at all. I mean, you can look at if you want to go for a 2-screen approach or a 1-screen approach. When I say 2-screen, I'm talking about the typical. You have the video on one side, the slides on the other. You might have other pieces of content there. You might want to share other videos you might want to share, stats that you've picked up in terms of through the surveys. You can also do things like having a physical background or a green screen. These just change the feel and the dynamic of the webinar quite significantly. And then you've got still surveys and other interactive features that you might want to include. And this changes the sort of level of audience interaction with that webinar, and very much changes the, what the people who are watching the webinar are going to get out of it. And this is all about, what kind of webinar do you want to have? These are the questions you need to ask. Again, with the video cutaways, it gives it that nice, tighter feeling, a lot slicker. A bit like news, magazine, TV shows we have, where you'll have people sitting down in a room and suddenly you'll cut to a video transmission. It just sort of breaks it up for the presenters. If you're doing a live webinar, it's great to have that sort of 5 minutes just to recollect yourself. But it's also great for the viewers to maybe be taken outside the studio environment and have something a bit more refreshing. So I think what I'm really getting to point is, when we think of the different types of webinars, it's not just about the function, it's about how we want the webinar to look, what technology you want to take advantage of, if you want to use any particular high-level production techniques. And I think really with the way that technology is moving in terms of internet capabilities, the fact you can now stream most video content on your phone, we're now in a position where there's almost a blur between what is web television, what's webcasting, and what are webinars. And I think they're going to become quite antiquated terms, and we're going to have more of a sort of web communication strategy that will envelop it all. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Stephane. Thanks very much. So, Sarah, what's been your experience of the different ways in which webinars can be used?
Well, I think it was really interesting what Stephane was saying about sort of thinking about your key messages, because obviously there's, as he was just saying as well, there's terminology for webcasting, webinars, web streaming, web conferencing. So it's really about coming back to your communication strategy, coming back to what message you want to project, and thinking about what you want people to actually do once they've engaged with you. So I've kind of talked through perhaps some similar points here, but maybe get into a bit more detail on some things, breaking it down into different types of free or paid for content, education and learning and marketing, which we talk about quite a lot, but also internal communications and thought leadership. The whole sort of market for webinars is obviously exploding at the moment, so there's quite a lot to think about and get your head around. I'm just going to talk about free webinars first. In terms of content marketing strategies, giving away useful tips and advice is something that obviously a lot of people are doing, so that they're talking about issues that affect their audience rather than just talking about their product. And then through blogging and social media, using webinars and videos, people are starting to generate leads and maybe reinforcing existing relationships or getting a bit deeper into a sales process with a potential client. So free webinars are massive, as Stephane was saying at the beginning of his talk, and you may well have already signed up, or you can sign up for all kinds of interesting content, and it's really worth actually going and having a look what's out there. If you are thinking about running your own webinars, then I really advise everyone to actually go and have a look at some of these free bits of content and see what kind of information and how it's presented, and think whether you want your users to actually be presented your information in that same way, or whether you want to perhaps present yourself differently, what kind of image you want to project. Of course, giving stuff away might not be completely altruistic. It's probably part of a larger master plan, because webinars usually sit within some kind of wider campaign alongside other types of marketing and learning resources. So again, it kind of comes back to planning your strategy and what kind of content, how much content you want to make and get out there. There's a study done by a company called ClickMeeting from August 2012, and they've analysed, it's more sort of online meetings, but terming that as a kind of webinar. I think it's 8,000 meetings that they analysed, and 85% of those companies said they use webinars to educate existing and potential customers. So that is really a kind of sales and marketing exercise. That's really kind of a big corner of the market at the moment. There's a really good infographic, which I've taken a slight bit of for this slide. But if you want us to share that infographic with you, then you can get in touch. This study also showed that the average webinar lasts for about an hour, usually has 2 presenters and an average of 28 participants. And 28 participants might not sound like very much, particularly if you're using this for sort of marketing and sales exercise, but when you consider that those people have actually actively signed up to engage with you and taken a time out of their day, then obviously, you know, it's a significant figure, and it might be much more effective and potentially less soul destroying than going to a speed networking event, perhaps. I came across this story about HubSpot, who again use a lot of free types of webinars alongside other social media content and blogging, and they're basically it's all towards selling their inbound marketing software. But I just thought it was really interesting because it does actually show that you can get tens of thousands of viewers, because a lot of people think webinars are quite small sort of numbers of users, but you know, potentially if you're presenting something that is really useful to thousands of people, then there is an opportunity to get a big audience. But obviously HubSpot are internet marketing company, so they're really, really good at this stuff, so fair play to them. So if you actually check out their site, you'll see that the type of topics that they cover in their webinars obviously aligned with their business activity. So that's coming back to that lesson we were just talking about, which is really about thinking about what subjects your audience will want to be interested in, so that you can build these free webinars to actually build up a community of followers. Think about the kinds of presentations that you can create to help people solve business issues, always sort of, you know, keeping that connection between you as a company and them, so that they think of you when they might have a requirement for your product or service. And obviously with free webinars, you're normally signing up, leaving your details, leaving your name, phone number. Obviously if you're putting a webinar together, you can fill in certain fields, choose how much information you want to gather from your audience. So it's a bit of a win-win situation to a certain extent, where the person watching is getting some free information that's useful to them, and then you get all the marketing data. So there's obviously the whole benefit around search engine optimization as well as lead generation, because you're gathering all this data and getting your content out there at the same time. So free webinars tend to fall into that category unless it's just somebody who's absolutely passionate about their subject and wants to get their information out there. Obviously in terms of educational uses of webinars, Stephane talked about continual professional development, or CPD. So these are usually kind of detailed courses, tutorials, exams, usually where people get some kind of certification, or it might be a legal requirement that they have to actually go through this learning to keep up to date with their professional interests. And this is really big business, because obviously in lots of professions it is a legal requirement. So there's loads of CPD stuff going on. It might be something you're already involved in or something you want to think about. There's obviously a lot of other educational webinars and webcasts happening, which might be more to do with colleges, universities and schools. There's a site called Edutopia, which has a lot of free webinars that are all run through, funded by sponsored companies. It's kind of a altruistic endeavour. Or you could look at Open University for examples, or obviously just Google education, college webinars, and there's absolutely tons of educational content out there. And there's loads of great examples as well of schools actually connecting up between schools to deliver learning and letting children collaborate. We were talking about an example before of young people actually engaging with professionals in certain industries to get direct live access to them and get on chat rooms and talk to them as part of careers advice. One actually really good example in the educational field I came up in terms of actually paid for content, so something that wasn't free, was to do with a guy who'd started a startup, online classes for learning about stocks and trading in stocks and options rather. And he got up to 50,000 students worldwide in just 3 years. So if you think 50,000 times an annual subscription of a significant nature, then the sums do start to add up. So there's quite a lot of businesses that are actually building themselves up around educational content. So that's an example similar to the one Stephane showed before. This is kind of moving on to sort of medical education and continual professional development in that sector. And you will find that a lot of these types of content are maybe free to view, maybe you'd have to subscribe, but they're actually funded by sponsors. So it's usually something to think about where the actual conference or the webinar itself, however it's coming together, it's actually being funded by sponsors who want to align themselves with a particular research area or a particular brand. And obviously this kind of content can be much more interactive. You can have kind of stepping through a series of multiple choice questions to get a certificate at the end, as we were talking about before. And usually as an educational tool, webinars will just be the sort of beginning of the journey. So people might join a webinar live or on demand. They might then go off to do a survey. There might be a live chat room. And obviously once it's on demand, they can keep coming back to that content again and again. So there is a lot of crossover really between the kind of marketing and the educational content, because at the end of the day, most educational organisations are businesses that have to make money to survive, so that there's usually a bit of a crossover there. Another example of a sponsored webcast was this one, which is coming up around January 2012, which was Nancy Duarte, who is a speaker she runs her own company, which is kind of a presentation consultancy. And she's obviously come in with Harvard Business Review. So you get a lot of these kind of relationships, again, sort of sponsored kind of media partnership relationship where the actual sponsors are funding the webinar production. But obviously you would imagine that both companies involved are actually sharing the data. So they're email marketing maybe to their own 2 different lists, and then getting the word further out there and then sharing the marketing data once it's come through. And incidentally, if you're interested in presenting and presentations, Nancy Duarte is a really good person to follow. And there's some really good videos on her site of her speaking at TEDx and Thinking Digital in the UK. Just to go back to the marketing side of things for a moment, webinars can be a really good way of keeping in touch with your customers and obviously making yourself look clever and knowledgeable. So it's worth, again, thinking about what's your specialist subject and where you want to position yourself if you are giving out free webinars. A recent study showed that 59% of senior executives now prefer watching video. So, you know, that's quite a significant figure, and that was 80% up. They watch more video than they did a year ago. So, you know, you can see this whole trend happening that people want to get their information this way. And obviously as part of a decision-making process, part of a buying process, video and webinars can be really powerful at getting across detailed information. So just to kind of finish up here, in terms of kind of the sales cycle and different types of webinar that might fall into a company sales cycle, you've got lead generation, which we've talked quite a lot about. A qualification or a sort of qualifying prospects type webinar would be something where you might want to consider this as your elevator pitch or getting across some much more detailed information. So it would be like maybe an invite only to some qualified people who you think are interested, but it'll really allow you to weed out the folks who are just kind of looking around for information or people who really want to buy from you. Obviously at this point, if people really express an interest, you might then want to get into a really detailed one-to-one kind of product demonstration or training. So someone who won't commit to a face-to-face time with you initially, they might well be happy to opt in for a kind of online training or product demo, and they might end up really happy like the people in this slide. Again, you know, that might have a knock-on effect of saving time in your support team on answering the same questions over and over again. So it's all good stuff. I guess the last thing I'd say is that, just to finish up and say thank you, is that, you know, I do think webinars and webcasts and all this technology we now have are really, really effective tools, and they can be inexpensive, they can definitely be totally scalable. And sort of developing skills in your organisation for presenting and getting different teams to collaborate, marketing and support and sales, can be a really positive thing. And as I was saying before, I think if you're moving into this area, it's a really good idea to actually start joining some webinars yourselves, even if you only join for 5 and 10 minutes, and just actually see what different kind of presentations and platforms are out there, and think about how you might want to use them or not use them, how you might want to do things differently, because that can be really useful. And that's Great. It from me. I think I just have one more slide with my contact details and reference to Flickr pictures.
Thank you, Sarah. That was really, really interesting. Thank you very much, the two of you. So, I mean, can I just ask you, Stephane?
Yeah, sure.
You mentioned there's this very broad definition of a webinar, and
Yeah.
you talked about the types of questions that sort of clients should be asking themselves before they embark on which type of webinar they should be adopting. And you talked about a lot of it's to do with setup in terms of how
Yeah.
many presenters and how many. But I mean, to what extent is that? Should the content be driving that? Because obviously, if you're a lawyer giving a webinar on a legal development to clients compared to a salesperson from a construction company who's just trying to sell a product, I mean, what sort of questions should they be asking in terms of the content that they're...
Yeah, I think this is a very valid point. I think you need to probably ask yourself 3 questions before you decide to do a webinar. I think the first thing is, why am I doing this webinar? Am I doing it for marketing? Am I doing it for training? Or any of the other number of reasons I mentioned there before? And then, who am I looking to attract? That's the second question. I think the third question, which was what do I want? What kind of webinar do I want? Is the last one. I think once you've got the answer to those first 2 questions, it becomes a lot easier to then analyse. Do I want to use green screen? Do I want it to be live? Or do I want it to be on demand? So, yeah, I think that those 2 questions at the beginning are probably vital to getting it right. I think it's almost bring it back to websites. It's your first impression of a company now. The first time you ever see a company, it's their website. And if you think of the variety of websites you have nowadays, it's unbelievable. I mean, you can tell if a website's American or is UK based just by the layout of it. And I think that gives you an instant impression of the company. And I think that, the same is really right for webinars as well. So you need to be thinking about who you want to be attracting. Are you going after a particular audience? And that will really set the tone of what webinar you're going to have. And then that will probably lead you to answering the questions I posed beforehand as well.
Because I mean, we've talked about marketing and education as being the sort of 2 sort of prime beneficiaries of webinars. But I mean, actually, there are other sectors, loads of other sectors that could benefit as well, aren't there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, because although there's been quite an explosion of this recently, and they have been around for a while, it's still probably the tip of the iceberg. I mean, I think, in terms of, you think about sort of, we've been talking a lot about kind of more professional education, but in terms of schools, we were working with an organisation called Film Club, and they were taking film directors and actors into their office, streaming these interviews out, and the kids get onto a chat room and they can directly ask questions and get live feedback, and that's really powerful. And it means that children in schools all across the UK who would never, I mean, Film Club do actually occasionally take people to, real film producers to schools, but obviously they can reach 20, 30 schools at the same time through doing it that way, and kind of really, educate people and get these kids really excited.
And recruitment as well. We talked earlier about recruitment.
Yeah, I think there are options available within recruitment in terms of, I mean, we had someone that works for us that had to come down from Scotland for an interview, and you think that's quite a big expense for them. You think you could probably do, the first or second interview essentially, especially when you do a presentation. I remember doing an interview 5 years ago and had to prepare a PowerPoint presentation for it. And really, I could have done that online. It cost me sort of £50 in travel to come for my interview, and that's something I foresee migrating more and more online. Especially as I think now we're entering a time where there's more candidates for a specific role, and if I'm a recruiter, I probably don't want to see every particular candidate at once. I want to probably whittle them down a bit, and that's another effective tool for using it. I think it's true though that there are many different aspects for webinars that's not yet been tapped into. I think one of the most recent ones has been auctions. I think you've always had the auction where you've had someone that can phone in and make a bet, but they have to listen to the whole auction for a phone call, and you've got to have that book in front of you. What lot number are they on now? When you think about having it as a webinar and being able to sit at home or even be on a train and watch on your phone and say, well, here's lot 45, which you knew you were interested in, or there might be someone else that comes up during it that you think actually that's quite interesting, and you might see it going for a particularly nice price, and you can go for it. And I think that's a market that's definitely going to sort of pick up a lot more.
And even I think you were talking before, mentioned sales pitches, but kind of agency pitches and that kind of thing. I mean, obviously there has been certain types of online communications, different platforms that are available to people, but they don't necessarily do exactly what you want them to do, and people are getting much more sophisticated now, thinking about higher resolution images and
so what technical advancements do you actually see in terms of?
I mean, I think that kind of thing's really interesting to me about sort of full body video, rather than just the talking head, which is fair enough. But I think the applications when you start thinking more about a kind of physical presence. And obviously multiple video feeds, so things like Google Hangouts coming onto the market. It's think it's pretty exciting, really.
And what about the interaction between real and virtual? I mean, that's something that
yeah, I mean, I guess that's something I'm more used to with coming from the kind of streaming events background, where you're obviously a one-way webcast where you're just literally sort of broadcasting on the internet. But I think people are now starting to think, well, if we've got a kind of conference with different tracks or it's a whole day of learning, then why not actually have a webinar as part of that physical event? So kind of mixing them up and not just thinking of them as two separate things.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about social media? I mean, how important is it, Stephane, to integrate social media into your webinar activity?
I think it depends on the webinar. I think if you're on Twitter, if you follow me, you'll see me retweeting a number of different webinars going on. I've got a friend that works in marketing team I've got friends that work in various marketing teams that run a number of webinars, and they're always sending me invitations. And I think they're critical to the success of a webinar. And I think, if we start thinking about, especially particularly live events like you're talking about beforehand, giving people the ability to maybe put a tweet box in there or a LinkedIn chat box, it sort of changes the level of interactivity to being someone on the webinar to something that's more, I guess, more outside of it. So you can have your hashtags and things like that for particular events. And I imagine it'll be something that will work primarily for larger scale events than the smaller ones. But if if you think of some of the large shows that they do broadcast now, so things like E3, the entertainment expo they have in Los Angeles every year about the video game technology, or if you think about the Apple product launches, that's the kind of thing where if you put it through a webinar and you can bring in the social media, you can add a lot more to it, the hashtags, the comments, and that will sort of take you away from the regular chat box you might have on some webinars.
There's a lot more control, isn't there, over a webinar? You have more control.
You have a lot more control. I mean, in a webinar you have a lot of control, but also, I mean, with the technology available to you now, you can control the social media coming in as well. With the moderators you have, you can, highlight particular comments, just like you do on a television show. I mean, if you watch Question Time, for example, they get questions in through Twitter. They're not asking every question they get in, they're choosing the questions they want to ask. And I think that's sort of where I think that's where webinars are heading, more down this television route. And using that sort of, I guess, and I think social media is becoming a massive part of TV, especially for networks like Channel 4, where it seems you can't watch a TV show now without having a hashtag associated with it. And you've got apps where you'll have that second screen technology, you'll be watching a TV show, you have an app telling you what's going on, what someone's wearing in it so you can buy it, and everything like that. And I think that kind of interactivity is probably going to come this way.
I mean, you've probably got a lot of companies out there, probably smaller companies, that don't even utilise social media in terms of business. I mean, it's alien to them, perhaps. So, I mean, how would you say a webinar is a sort of good sort of push in the right direction in terms of how they should get started on?
Well, I think the most important thing to say straight away is that I think you'll find that webinars is much easier to judge ROI than it is on social media. I mean, I remember in one of my last roles, I'd spend ages on LinkedIn doing updates, joining groups, but there's no way for me to measure how effective that was. Whereas if you're doing it for marketing purposes and you've got a webinar, it's much easier to control, and monitor the activity that's coming in and out from that. And I think even more in terms of that for a company, with webinars, because they're so scalable, you don't have to jump into the deep end straight away. You can sort of get tip your toes in and build up a content library. And then I think that's would always be my advice of anything. You don't build the world's best website straight away. You take time to build it.
I mean, I was just going to say, actually, Sarah, I'm sorry, what were you?
No, go on.
There is a perception that from some people that webinars are just a sort of long form ad. How do you sort of steer people away from that?
Well, I think it's kind of just sort of picking up on that idea of building a community of viewers as well, because you might do that through various means, your existing contacts, social media. But obviously once people know you, and it's all about this thing of positioning yourself as the person to come to find out about this issue, and once people know you, then you can market and say, hey, if you've got 10 minutes on Friday at 3 o'clock, we're going to run a quick 10-minute session on ABC, ask questions, and I think, it's kind of, it doesn't have to be something really long, but it depends what message you're trying to get across. And at the end of the day, if it's on demand as well, people can always watch a bit of something, or you can film something live and then break it up into smaller chunks as well, or take the key learnings from it and repackage it. So there's
lots of different ways. What about clients who perhaps might feel that the stability of technology isn't particularly rigid? I mean, say cloud, for example.
Well, I think a lot of people's perception of webinars as you know, the stability being a question, it tends because they're managing them themselves. I mean, although they can be quite easy and quite straightforward to do, but the management of a webinar can be extremely difficult. You know, getting getting the speakers, making sure you've got the bandwidth space, everything of that nature, can make it a lot more of a complicated process than it needs to be. And I think that's where companies like ourselves really help for certain types of webinars to make sure they take that off of them.
So, I mean, you've actually, is this correct? You've got sort of 3 ways to do it. You can either buy the software yourselves, you can buy a hosted webinar service, or find a provider that manages the creation of each online web seminar. I mean, from your perspective, if you were a company just going into it from scratch, what would you advise them to do?
Well, I think it's worth, having a look around, maybe so you're aware of what you can get, but obviously it depends on how much time you've got, because even in my research with running up to the launch of Seansho, which we've been developing a very simple platform for streaming live video and slides and creating webinars, we've been really looking at this, and it's just kind of mind-boggling. There's so much out there. So, if you've got time and you've got a technical department and you can give them the research and that's their job, then look at the market. It's interesting and see what's out there. But obviously, if you haven't and you've got high production values, then it might be better to go straight to people who've already done the research and know the market and get some consultancy and advice from them. Yeah.
Stephane, do you agree with that?
Yeah, it's definitely. I think again, it comes back to what kind of audience you want to reach. What's the purpose of the webinar? Are you looking for? Because if you're looking to just do a quick lead generation tool and you're not so fussed about how it looks, and you think you can do it internally, then great. But if you want to have a real slick piece of content and utilise the power that is online video now, then you would come to a production company. I think that's what really that's why you've seen, I suppose, more companies coming towards this type of webinar, is because now online video is becoming such a bigger part of people's marketing strategy. The buzzword last year was content marketing, and webinars, it's just a big part of that.
But I mean, it's hugely important, isn't it, to let the event determine the technology and not the other way around?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is as well that, as I was saying earlier on, the sort of terminology webinar and webinar platforms have actually been around for quite a long time. So people might have had really bad experiences, kind of like video conferencing systems. And how many meetings have any of us been in where, it takes half an hour to get the thing working, and then you try and do something else and you have to get the technician in, and they're just a nightmare and they're very expensive. So I think, there's this kind of legacy market of these kind of technologies, but obviously we're moving to the next level. So I'm hoping that, in the next 10 years or so, there's going to be different products and different ways of doing things that maybe make the user experience a bit better. But, obviously it definitely should be led by coming back to that key thing we were talking about of sort of having your objectives in mind and knowing where you're trying to pitch your piece of communication.
And what you want out of it. With a sort of increasingly media savvy audience, how important are production values, would you say?
Yeah, I think they're very important. As I said, I think if you think about how much time and effort we spend on our websites alone, if you have a great website, but then you're linking out to pieces of content that don't have the same sort of production or thought process behind them, and the branding can be lost, and then suddenly the respect you worked so hard to get through your website, you can lose for that piece of content not being up to scratch. I remember watching television programs. If you could tell instantly if the production quality wasn't as good, and that would give you a negative opinion of that. And I think if you think now about online video, kids today can get a video camera and make a real slick piece of content, and they've got no budget. You're an organisation that's representing yourself. You're trying to sell a message. Then the production should be very high on your list, because any mistakes or any sort of poor quality that comes through is reflective of you and your company.
Great.
So yeah, I think it's massive.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, the two of you. So it's really important to let the events determine the technology and not the other way round. Pre-planning is crucial so that you know what you're trying to deliver and to what audience, so that you can evaluate which type of webinar works for you. And often it's worth speaking to some expert providers about how to progress. And with that, we'd like to conclude our webinar. In doing so, I'd like to thank our expert speakers, Sarah Platt, the Managing Director of Kinura, and Bombora TV's Head of Business Development, Stephane Barnett. We hope that this has been informative for you, and if you'd like to access the slides from this presentation, they can be downloaded from Bombora TV. Please send any further feedback on requests for information to Stephane at Bombora TV. We thank you for viewing.